Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise is a PS4 game based on a manga called Fist of the North Star from the 80s, and here this game being developed by the Yakuza team, or more precisely, you could say it is a Yakuza game. And so, yes, I'm back for another Yakuza review after 3 months, and why it took so long, even though I'll be honest, I have owned this game since December, and I've even planned to play it before playing Judgment, the other sort of Yakuza spin off. But the thing is, I wanted to read the manga for Fist of the North Star before going into this game, just for story reasons. And I just didn't expect it to be such an insurmountable task. For reference, Fist of the North Star is not the longest manga ever. It's 27 volumes, which is fairly long, but not the craziest. But man, was this a grating read. And not because it was bad or anything, it just did not felt like something that should be read all in one go. It's a bit too much of a buff man fighting overload, I don't know. But I'm not here to review the manga right now. We are here to talk about the game, which I now played since I was caught up, but I'll be honest, I didn't need to, as we enter now to talk about the story. The reason why I didn't really need to read the manga is because this doesn't really follow the story of Fist of the North Star at all, really. It's more of an alternative setting kind of thing, where it's very much its own story, where we get to see our main character, Kenshiro, and some of the other more popular characters from the manga in a sort of different situation. And to be fair, this decision makes sense when adapting this world to the Yakuza formula, since the original story is kind of always moving from location to location. Kenshiro doesn't really stick to the same place for long, and when adapting that to the Yakuza formula that is mostly about very set locations, obviously there has to be compromises. So from my point of view, you either pick to tell one specific story in that world, or you restructure it to fit within your structure, which I understand the decision here since it allows you to just fit a lot more different characters from different parts of the story. But surprisingly here, a lot of it is original. Most of the game takes place in the city created for the game called Eden, in that it works as your main area where all of the things you expect out of this type of game are. More on that later, of course. But back to the story here. It also has a unique villain, as in one created solely for this game, which I guess is interesting that they went with that decision. I mean, some fan favorites are still here as bosses. It's not like wholly original, but I'll be honest, the story of this game ended up feeling like one of those anime movies where new characters are introduced solely for the purpose of the movie, or in this case, game, and they don't really have any importance to our main character besides that very one-off adventure. And that's fine, but this game is very much like other Yakuza games where the game drones on with long cutscenes, and here it just isn't that interesting. Watching Kenshiro talk to someone when we already know how all of it is just gonna end up with two dudes punching each other feels a bit unnecessary, and I think it breaks the flow of the game. It's no Yakuza 5 in terms of how long these are, but I'll be honest, if I wasn't reviewing this game, I would have probably skipped the cutscenes. It's not a bad story per se either, but it's also very much a filler story that really should not be the reason for you to play it. Now then, let's move on to the actual gameplay, which probably is the reason you play this game, and oh man, is this a handful. So being based on the Yakuza formula, it is very much that beat 'em up style of combat, but with the quirks of Fist of the North Star, with pressure points and of course all the gore and blood. And at first it seems really cool, but I feel like as we get into this game, we're going to realize that a lot of what makes this Fist of the North Star also brings out a lot of the flaws in the combat with the changes it makes. And also, in some cases, doesn't even address them in the same way that a regular Yakuza would. But before we talk about that, let's just give you the basics of combat, where basically within an arena you fight either one-on-one, which is mostly for boss fights, or with various enemies, which will be most of the time. Move-wise, of course, you can move freely within the 3D space, and you can dodge and block, and all the standard stuff, as you can attack using light and strong attacks, which here is mostly a punch and kick button, and then of course being able to combo these in different ways, but this is also where the problem starts. One of the things even main Yakuza games can struggle with at times is crowd control, because most attacks are focused on attacking a single enemy, and so when you start introducing a high number of enemies in each encounter, and well, it does introduce that problem where dealing with each one individually becomes a bit of a chore, especially as the likelihood of being intruded by other enemies during a one-on-one fight is higher the higher enemies there are, and this game has a lot. I would say that on average Lost Paradise in every encounter has about double the amount of enemies you'd see in any other Yakuza game. And in a regular Yakuza game, the answer to this would be, as you level up, you can unlock moves that give you, abilities or attacks that do crowd control. Things like grabs and throws, or attacks that do some kind of swooping motion. And while there are some, it is really bare here. There are very few, and unfortunately I would say that most of them are stuck on the heat mode, which is the mode that makes you generally stronger, and so you have to build up to it by fighting, and of course it only lasts for a certain amount of time. It is just an odd choice. I get the idea to have a focus on singular fights, but then when you put so many enemies on screen, it's hard to understand the purpose. But I kinda do get it, because Lost Paradise is different, as it leans on something that, once again, all games in this series have, but usually not for the same reason, and that is the leveling up system. Usually I would say in most Yakuza games you can play through them and do some side quests maybe, and not even have to worry too much about your levels throughout the whole thing. But here it really feels like you need to play that extra content to stay in level, as if you simply play through the story you'll be under leveled, and so to me it did end up feeling a bit grindy, which is not something I ever felt with this type of game. If you're within the same level, you can usually kill basic enemies in 1 or 2 hits, and that helps a lot for crowd control of course. But then if you are not within level, it only highlights the problems further, and like I said, I found it a bit grindy. And I'll be honest, most definitely ended up this game under leveled, and it was a bit of a pain, and the big reason for it is how less interesting the side quests are as well. Mostly because I feel this game takes itself a lot more seriously than most Yakuza games, and so what ends up happening is the side quests or side activities are not as goofy, at least the ones I played, which I admit could have affected this perception, but I also think that the other major reason for this is the other big part of this game, the mini games, and here I also feel like they just fail a bit. There just isn't many of them here, or at least new ones to fit the setting. You still have the average ones like the baseball and the casino, and even a surprisingly good arcade with even an old Fist of the North Star game, but that's about it. Nothing stands out new that I feel like this setting calls for. Like the bartender minigame is so The only one that surprised me here, and which we'll now go into, because, well, why would something like this happen? Was it a budget thing? Laziness maybe? Well, I personally don't think so. What I think happened is they focused on this one main minigame, and everything else was kind of a second thought. And that is the racing and, I guess, kind of Mad Max experience you can get from exploring the wastelands instead of fast traveling. And in this wastelands you can of course just travel from location to location and find random encounters with other cars, as you primarily travel through the wasteland, and when they hit you, you have to stop and fight them, which is a bit of a lost opportunity to have some kind of crazy car combat, but whatever, I guess. You can also find items in this open world of sorts and improve your vehicle for races that you can do from Eden, the main city, like I mentioned before. And to be fair, this piece of the game does play fairly well. It's not realistic, but it is surprisingly fun, and it's not what you'd expect when you see a big off-road car, 4v4 type of thing, as the cars here drift a lot. It's kind of like the initial D video games, if you ever played any of those, also made by Sega, which not a good example because those games are Japanese exclusive at the moment, but another Sega example you probably get is Ridge Racer. Now, don't go buy this game expecting a Ridge Racer game, I'm just saying that right now, but more mentioning it to give you an idea of how the game feels, with the very drifty, without losing speed kind of experience you get, where it's almost like a gliding sensation like Ridge Racer. That's why I used it as an example. But I feel like the game doesn't take advantage of it with its tracks, and I think that's one of the most disappointing things about the races part, as it's kind of boring, and I think because the tracks are just a bit too bland. They have some curves, but the tracks are for the most part just very wide and hard to mess things up, which takes away the challenge, making it a lot more dependent on the upgrades of your car, which just isn't that fun for me personally. They do try to mix it up with obstacles and power-ups in the stages to make you go faster and to incentivize you to collect coins in the races that you can then exchange for upgrades, but to me it just was not engaging enough for long, as I felt once again that it was grindy, as if I had gone and tried to fully upgrade my car, I would have had to just replay the same races so many times, and I just didn't find it worth it. And overall I think the grind is the biggest problem there, and of course the races being somewhat bland in my opinion. And overall I think that's kind of what stopped me from enjoying the game in its whole, as it just felt a bit too grindy, and I think that is like a major reason. It would still be a bit of an underwhelming game without it, but it would have been much more of a enjoyable experience as a Yakuza spin-off if the level up system just wasn't there or was a lot less serious. Now let's mention just a few things to clean up this bit about the gameplay and move on. The last few things I want to mention are enemy variety, which is once again, they had the opportunity to go wild with this setting and they don't. It's mostly just the regular enemies, then small, fast enemies, and then big, strong enemies, which their main thing is that you have to break their defenses to then hit their pressure points, which another big thing with this game, with the bigger enemies, it's very rare to actually just punch them to death, as it is very much about weakening them and then hitting their pressure points, which for those who don't know what pressure points are, it's basically special attacks based on the manga counterpart of the same name, where our main character Kenshiro will hit certain parts of an enemy's bodies that would have some kind of effect that usually ends up in a big explosion with a lot of blood. Which, to be fair, does look pretty cool and is faithful to the manga, which is good. I just wish I could do it to more than one at a time. Regardless, staying here with the enemies, the bosses are okay. Obviously they had to go through a lot of fan favorites and that's good, but I feel a bit cheated, as if you read or watch Fist of the North Star, you know that most villains are other buff men like Kenshiro, so I went in expecting that. But then our first boss here is actually like a giant, and it made me think that maybe there was going to be more variety than there actually was, or that I thought it was going to be. And it's very weird that I had that expectation tempered and the game still managed to mess that up. It's not really its fault, but just a funny thing, because at the end of the day you're gonna fight buff man. That's really what this game is about. Temper your expectations despite the first boss. Now, final thing I want to mention here is the skill tree, which here we have 4 of them, each for a specific thing like special attacks or health and power or special abilities. I didn't even bother talking about where you have equipables which give you abilities you can activate with a D-pad, things like cause X damage or raise attack or be invincible for a certain amount of time. It really is just okay, nothing worth writing home about. The most notable thing here is that they are symbolized by different characters from the game and also characters not in the game but from the world of Fist of the North Star, which, while nice, it probably just annoys people that they're just there as skills rather than actual characters in the game. But back to the skill tree here, following in the footsteps of Yakuza Ichin, where you have once again multiple skill trees and skill trees using different color skills, but here it's a bit different. Every slot is color coded and you can't just use colorless points wherever you want. It's more of a every skill tree has a lot of spots for those colorless points, which are the ones you get the most, of course, and then colored ones, which are supposed to be more special spots, sort of, where you put the more specialized skill points for each tree. And I've been negative enough with this game, so all I'll say is I prefer the one in Ichin. So now let's move on to talk about the graphics, and honestly, I had to double take when I saw that this game came out in 2018 because it looks like it could have been a PS3 game, honestly, and I personally didn't mind it. Obviously, they're going for a more cartoony look with very prominent shadows and a gritty look, and of course, the overdose of muscly men. And while I think that is faithful to the source material, I think that the end product does look a bit weird, maybe even a bit bland, which I admit is a bit of a personal preference, but also Yakuza games are very colorful and shiny, I guess I would say. But here, trying to imitate that, especially at night, with all the neon sights and lights, it just doesn't really work with the setting. And I think they probably should have just doubled down on what Fist of the North Star looks like, rather than try to inject this more Yakuza-like features, visually at least. But I'll still say it's not a big deal. It wasn't like, oh my god, this game is horrible looking, but it's not a great looking game either. But what is great, I'll be honest here, it's the soundtrack. It's interesting here with rock and the sound reminiscent of the time Fist of the North Star was being published or the anime was coming out, around the 80s, but also a lot of modern sound in that same genre, and even some weird electronic music that reminded me of the Pillar Man theme from JoJo, if you know what that is, which I guess is fitting since they're both buff men heaven, but regardless, I enjoyed that, as one of my biggest complaints with other Yakuza spin-offs is that they sound a bit too much like Yakuza, but this one doesn't really suffer from that. And I will say, important to mention, that most sounds here outside of the main soundtrack are very much just pulled from Yakuza. For example, very basic things like picking up an item or buying something, and even beyond that, Kenshiro's voice actor is the same as Kazuma, which is very funny, and no offense to the voice actor, but I'll be honest, every time he talked, I could really just hear Kazuma, but that wasn't enough for me to put it back in the English dub it defaulted to. Once again, no offense, but it was a bit cheesy for me. And overall, I do think you need to enjoy a lot of the cheese of Fist of the North Star to truly enjoy this game, and also be able to put up with its more grindy nature, like I said before. Which, I'll be honest, I didn't, and I think that affected my score a lot, as I am giving Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise a 6 out of 10. It's still a good game, it's still better than what so far has been the weakest Yakuza game, Kenzen, but second to last is not the greatest achievement, even if it's not a bad game. Now, recommendations wise, well, if you like Yakuza, then only play this one if you exhausted your options and you're not willing to go and try the Japanese offerings, which I get. It is a bit weird to play a game you can't really fully understand because of that language barrier. Now, for Fist of the North Star fans, I actually think you'll probably enjoy this. It does fulfill that sort of fantasy of playing as Kenshiro and being as badass as he is, and if that's what you want, then I think this might do it for you. I never played any of the other Fist of the North Star games on the PS3, so I don't know how those compare to this one, but given this one is based on the Yakuza combat, I think it gives you a better reference point to see if you would like it even without playing. Regardless of any of that though, and whatever your decision may be, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing, liking, and even commenting, all things that you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye.